This video is sponsored by the Pack Tactics Kobold and Gator Dice Sets Kickstarter. This week I've been talking about different factions in D&D, and today we're going to keep that going by designing a dungeon all about different factions. We're not going to sit down and map out the dungeon today, that'll be a different video, but today we're just going to figure out which factions are in this dungeon. See, for a long time I've wanted to design a dungeon called the Temple of the Elephant, and the basic idea is that inside the dungeon there are a bunch of different factions and monsters and cults all trying to convert the temple into their own home base. It's kind of a riff on some classic dungeons like the Caves of Chaos or the Sunless Citadel, where the players aren't necessarily going to go to war with any of the factions. Some, or all of them, can be reasoned with. And in fact, I ran a scaled down version of this very adventure in a previous campaign, where these three dungeon factions were each battling with each other for control over a dungeon. It was a mine instead of a temple, but it was the same basic idea. But for this version, I wanted to add a couple of factions. So now there are 5 factions, all battling with each other over control of this temple, each one occupying one section of the dungeon and trying to hold on to their own territory, while also trying to eliminate the other factions and control more of the dungeon. Now, free time can be hard to come by these days, so often my D&D prep is a casualty of that. But a few months ago, I just put the Temple of the Elephant on the map I gave my players because I wanted to essentially force myself to start working on this dungeon, and I knew I would be a lot more likely to do that if I just put it on the map. And I do have a video series where I talk about the different ways I design dungeons. So today we're just going to talk about the process of designing a dungeon, starting with different factions at war within that dungeon and using that as our point of inspiration. This is basically part 1 of developing the Temple of the Elephant, fleshing out the factions and saving the map for a future day. So the theme of the dungeon is that each faction is serving some greater force, some powerful creature who that faction reports to. And so the first faction is easy. We already figured them out in another video earlier this week, which should already be out. If it's not, you'll see it very soon, but it should have come out a couple days ago. Our first faction is the Cult of Vecna. The leader, Witness Ezekiel, is basically a nobleman. He's wealthy and he surrounds himself with very fine things. I can imagine him in this chamber deep inside a dungeon, and unlike the rest of the dungeon, his chambers are decorated with silks and lit by candlelight, and he wears very fine clothes, and he doesn't like to get his hands dirty. But don't misunderstand. He's very much capable of holding his own in battle, should it come to that. The other members of the cult are probably just what you'd expect. They're acolytes who can cast spells and chant ominously about the Whispered One, the God of Secrets, the undying king they venerate. But Witness Ezekiel claims to actually communicate with Vecna. This temple has given him access to his god in a way that he never has had before. He goes into this private chamber that only he's allowed to go to, in the center of the temple itself, and comes back with orders from Vecna. What's going on there? Seems weird. But yeah, that's our first faction. I figured them out in my other video about how I was going to integrate the Cult of Vecna into my campaign, so they were basically already ready to deploy by the time we got to this video. So we just need to develop the other factions to that same level. We need to know who they are, who's in charge, and who's really in charge. Oh, by the way, I didn't really establish this before, but Ezekiel still holds as much wealth as he can. He hoards as much finery as he's able to get his hands on to make himself feel like he's surrounded by wealth, but he also brings diamonds and jewelry to his communications with Vecna, and he never returns them. It seems like he has to basically sacrifice them as part of his ritual. But he's still very much holding onto his own wealth because he likes to surround himself with these fine things and all the comforts of modern living, which gives him a real aristocratic flair. So the next faction we're going to introduce in this dungeon is a little tribe of kobolds. I love kobolds, I cannot get enough of them, and frankly, it's a huge dereliction of my duty as a game master that my party is 6th level, and I've not faced a kobold yet. That needs to be corrected. So let's bring in some kobolds. Now, I've already mentioned in a previous video how I'm going to introduce some dragons into this campaign, and I imagine I could bring in kobolds through one of those interactions, like there's a dragon who's going to want the Sword of Kaz back from the players, so there could be some kobolds around trying to find out who has the sword and report back to the dragon and his agents with that information. Maybe even a couple of them will even try to jump the players, and it'll be, quite frankly, adorable. But I also want a bunch of kobolds running around in a dungeon, and so that's what we're going to do with our second faction. They work for a dragon who lives deep inside the temple, who the kobolds call the Gnashing Terror. He has teeth as sharp as swords and cracked, oozing lips. Anytime the kobolds are in his presence, he fills them with dread. So indeed, he must be a dragon. There's literally nothing else he could be, with a big scary mouth full of fangs and the ability to fill you with fear. And any of the kobolds can be summoned before the Gnashing Terror, and they have to prostrate themselves before his slobbering mouth, which is just visible through a crack in the wall, but the whole dragon is in the other room, and you don't want to see him, no siree. But please do bring him lots of gold you find in other places in the dungeon, which is clearly being added to his hoard, because every time the kobolds return to the fissure where they can speak to the Gnashing Terror, whatever coins they brought last time are now gone. But also, the Gnashing Terror has some kobold who works directly under him and acts as his representative out in the rest of the dungeon, issuing commands to the others. So let's name that kobold. A few years ago, in my second to last story arc of my old actual play show, before COVID killed it, I introduced a group of kobolds led by a wizard kobold named Anklefang. He was trying to use humans as test subjects for a ritual to imbue his fellow kobolds with incredible strength, and that character was so much fun. I think I'm going to just lift Anklefang and drop him into this dungeon. Because he was incredibly intelligent, he was something like a 10th level spellcaster, he could make maybe not persuasive arguments to allow you to use them as a human sacrifice, but you could at least understand that they were logically consistent. And he actually was a cunning and dangerous spellcaster. But also, he was a kobold. As one of my players said in that session, kobolds are dungeon pigeons. And I like that dichotomy because I want the players to take the threat of kobolds seriously, but also they're just kobolds. It's not that serious. And yet that underestimation is part of what makes kobolds so dangerous. I love giving kobolds a lot of shitty little traps, but they also are good traps, despite the fact that they're made out of garbage. In that adventure I ran, the kobolds had actually built a mechanical dragon out of wood and leather, and they could all ride around inside it, like the fake bird in A Bug's Life. Kobolds are not the biggest threats in the world, but underestimate them at your own peril. And I think Anklefang is the perfect character to get myself into that headspace when I designed this section of the dungeon. Of course, another way to get into the headspace of your villain is to actually have specific dice that represent them at the table, just like you might with a player character. And whether you're a player or a game master, you should absolutely get your hands on some dice that have a little kobold inside them, or maybe a little gator, which is why you should check out today's sponsor, the Pack Tactics Kickstarter. Hello there, it's me, Winnie the Pooh. I'm a charming sidekick of a D&D YouTuber, which means I have a lot in common with Kobold, the sidekick of Gator on the popular YouTube channel, Pack Tactics. That's true, that's the dynamic between them, don't look it up. And I wish I could spend more time with both of them, but sadly we just don't get as much time to get together as we would like to play games, you know how it goes. But fortunately, I can still invite them to my D&D game if I support the Kickstarter for the Pack Tactics Dice Set. Pack Tactics is working with the fantastic team at Only Crits to create sets of dice that have either Kobold or Gator inside them. These gorgeous dice sets can be yours, but now is your last chance to get your hands on them. If you support the Kickstarter, you can also get other fantastic add-ons, like a dice tray with either Gator or Kobold on it, or their chunk D20s, which are these huge D20s with whichever creature inside you choose. Or both if you want, get both dice, why not? You can also get some adventures you can start playing and using your dice right away. And today is the very last day of the campaign, so make sure you visit the link in the description today, so you can back the Pack Tactics Kickstarter for Kobold and Gator dice sets. And thank you so much to the team behind Pack Tactics and Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Cheerio! Okay, so next up on our list of factions is a band of goblins. Now, the players have faced some goblins before in the very first adventure of this campaign, so this time I'm going to use them as an opportunity to present them with a lot more different versions of goblinoids and show off the whole hierarchy of how hobgoblins and goblins and bugbears work together and their dysfunctional dynamic they have, which means we need at least the hobgoblin leader of this group. Now, the idea behind hobgoblins and their culture in general is that they're a lot more militaristic, and so I think we need to represent this by having the leader of this faction be a military leader. This is a hobgoblin who is trying to secure this temple because it would give them a good strategic position to start to prepare an invasion of the entire valley. This temple is on the edge of the map I provided for my players. It's at the edge of the valley, so I can easily believe that these hobgoblins and goblins and bugbears came here from somewhere off the map, somewhere to the east, and they're hoping that they can use this as their base of operations, because clearly the fact that these 5 factions are fighting over it and are not able to defeat each other means that this is probably a pretty defensive position, not just from the outside, but specifically from the inside. There are probably layers of defenses you can use to hold this temple. Now, I don't really know if this makes any sense from a military standpoint, but this is enough of a justification for me to rationalize why these goblins are here, and that's all I need. So let's name this hobgoblin general. Actually, let's not make him a general, because that implies he's too far up the ranks. Let's make him a colonel. That's high enough ranking to lead a field mission, but not so high that he wouldn't still have some superiors that he has to report back to. I know military ranks really well because I watched 10 seasons of Stargate SG-1, and 5 seasons of Stargate Atlantis, and 2 seasons of Stargate Universe, and that web series about young Cassandra that was on the Stargate streaming service back when that was a thing. I like Stargate. Did you hear they announced that there's going to be another Stargate TV show? That sounds cool. Let's do another one of those. I like them. Anyway, let's name this military leader Colonel Crag. That is the hobgoblin who leads this group of goblinoids. However, now that he's brought his forces to this temple, Colonel Crag has formed an uneasy alliance with a banshee who already lived in this temple and who was able to offer some sound tactical advice, but will also execute her wrath on a goblin if they displease her. Crag and his lieutenants have had war meetings in the crypts below the temple, and this wailing voice fills the air, this screechy, high-pitched voice telling them what to do in very direct ways, even though this banshee is certainly not a member of the chain of command. Crag does not take orders from outsiders. But if one of the goblins or hobgoblins or bugbears says something that annoys the banshee, they hear this wailing cry, and the soldier who spoke out is paralyzed, or maybe even just drops dead. Clearly that's a banshee. She can be nothing else, and she must be appeased. So Crag is trying to do what she asks, and that's helpful because she does seem to want some of these other factions out of the temple, and her intel is useful. but he also really resents having to answer to this ghost that barks orders at them and does not respect them at all. Crag worked hard to get to this position, both within the military and just to get this assignment in general, so he is starting to reach his breaking point with this Banshee. Oh, it also doesn't help that she keeps asking him to bring back any valuables the goblins find in the other sections of the dungeon, like the ones they raid from the other factions. Colonel Crag would really like to hold on to some of these gems and art objects and things, because once they continue their push into the rest of the valley, he will need to sell some of those for equipment and horses and things. But the Banshee demands some of the material goods that remind her of her old life, so the goblins have to keep giving up a share of their loot, and it's starting to get really annoying. The fourth faction in this dungeon is a tribe of snake men. Once again, I want to be very clear. If this is an adventure I plan to publish at some point in the future, I want to make sure you understand that I would never use Yuan-Ti in a public adventure. They are copyright Wizards of the Coast, a subsidiary of Hasbro, and once again, it is extremely weird that you brought them up out of nowhere. I'm having a conversation about my completely original snake men in my dungeon, and you're bringing up these copyrighted characters from Dungeons and Dragons? Am I pronouncing that correctly? I truly have no idea what you're talking about. But anyway, there's a coalition of snake men inside the dungeon, and they're being led by High Priestess Amunet. That's a reference to the titular mummy in the 2017 Mummy movie starring Tom Cruise. Not a great movie. Had a couple good gags that made me laugh, but ultimately it's a pretty rough way to start a franchise. But I've been catching up on the podcast called Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe, where they basically just come up with all the movies that would have existed in this franchise and pitch them to each other like they're making their own Infinity Saga equivalent of Universal monster movies. Their fourth pitch is for The Invisible Man, which they pitch as a slapstick comedy starring John C. Reilly, and if it had ever actually been made, it would have been the best movie of all time. So anyway, all that to say, this version of the Mummy is on my mind, so that name is easy for me to remember. And you know what? I think this High Priestess is serving an actual mummy, or maybe even a mummy lord. Now, obviously this mummy lord can't be running around helping this faction by casting high-level spells and plunging its hand into people's chests and ripping out their hearts, because that would be game over for this entire scenario. This mummy is still trapped in its sarcophagus. It's immobile. The sarcophagus is open, but the mummy can't move. It's kind of like Shendu in Jackie Chan Adventures. You just hear this voice coming from the mummy, but right now it's still trapped and restrained. But it can sometimes speak to the High Priestess. It can speak to everyone in special, sacred, scheduled ceremonies. And this mummy even has the power to turn you to dust without even lifting its arms, without even seeming to move. So just imagine what can happen when this mummy is finally freed. And all that has to happen is the snake men have to wipe out the other factions, because clearly their very presence profanes the temple. Once the High Priestess can cleanse the unbelievers and the snake men are the only ones remaining, then the mummy will be freed. Oh, and naturally the mummy also wants any wealth they discover, which the snake men are all too happy to part with. They don't need it. They don't care. And the last faction in the dungeon is a gang of Gnolls. They want to turn this temple into an altar to their demon lord and do some freaky demon magic, but obviously they have to get rid of all these other factions before they can get access to the parts of the temple they want to use for their dark magic. However, as soon as they arrived, they discovered that a Medusa known as the Princess of Stone had taken up residence in one of these sacrificial chambers near the center of the temple, very close to the area that the Gnolls need to access in order to convert this temple to their own domain. So they keep the Medusa appeased, because anytime they start to go up the stairs and give her trinkets and baubles and finery, she allows them to leave. They just have to keep their eyes closed, and they're good. But if they ever approach the Medusa with the intention of killing her and regaining control of the center of the temple, the Gnolls are turned to stone. So they placate her and make them think they're working with her. Well, obviously they're just trying to kill the other factions that have taken over the temple, and hopefully find another access point for the ritual room in the center of the temple, the one they need to get access to. Within the heart of Gnoll territory, in the dungeon, there's a stairway leading up to the ritual chamber, and this stairway is now decorated with statues of Gnolls with their swords out, ready to attack the Medusa. But they were never able to do so. So the Princess of Stone is safely inside the ritual chamber in the heart of the temple. Presumably. Obviously no one can actually look at her, but she calls out to them every once in a while, demanding tribute, and there's nothing else that's intelligent that can turn you to stone, that can call out to you, and also their gaze turns you to stone, because that's not a basilisk and it's not a cockatrice, so it's got to be a Medusa. That can be nothing else. So these are the factions, all these different groups that believe in their hearts of hearts that the best thing for them to do is to destroy each other and appease their ally or lord or king or god in the center of the temple. And of course, they also have to hand over lots of their money. It's very important that they don't just eliminate their political enemies, but they also give all their money to their leader, who profits off of all their misery and is located firmly in the center of the Temple of the Elephant, the D&D adventure I'm writing. Now, I don't have time to make a map for this today, but the next step would be to figure out the map, add a whole bunch of different chambers that belong to each faction, and some that haven't been claimed that still have some resources within them that others can discover. And there are also probably other monsters or traps in other areas of the dungeon that are not affiliated with any of these other factions. And the other thing I need is to figure out some plot hooks so my players can actually get hooked to this adventure and go check out the dungeon. But I have plenty of time before I need to worry about that. The players have some other dungeons that they're going to go to next before they ever go to the Temple of the Elephant. I just know this dungeon's going to take a lot of time to put together in the way that I'm really hoping I can, and that means getting a head start on it and breaking it up into more manageable pieces. After all, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. That's not why I named this dungeon the Temple of the Elephant. There's another reason, but I'm not going to lie. Given the way that I'm approaching designing it and making content around that process, it is kind of perfect. However, I think the next adventure my players are going to go on is a mission into a dungeon full of undead, and I still need to prep that adventure, so I'm going to make a video about that next month. And then probably early next year, I'll come back to the Temple of the Elephant and we'll start mapping it out. But I've got some other really cool videos planned between now and then, some topics I want to talk about for a long, long time, including but not limited to more Critical Role videos and another Daggerheart video. So if you want to see all that and more, make sure you like and subscribe and hit the bell so you can make sure you're staying up to date with everything I've got going on right now, because I've got a lot of awesome stuff I'm working on and you're not going to want to miss any of it. And speaking of missing things, if you missed my video where I started building a government for my homebrew setting, you can check that video out right here. Oh. Hi, Ottowick.
Hey, hope we're cool about yesterday. Look, can I make a quick suggestion?
Sure, you're the algorithm wizard. You help get my videos in front of my viewers. You help me figure out what videos are going to do well. What's up?
Well, you remember earlier in this video when you referenced your old actual play podcast?
Yeah.
Well, could you knock that off? I don't know why you keep bringing it up.
Oh, well, I mean, I bring it up because it has a lot of good examples in it, and because a lot of my old fans from that show were actually the first viewers on this channel, so...
Well, you have a new audience now, alright? And they don't care about some show you did years ago. It's alienating your viewers. Nobody's going back and watching old episodes of a C-tier actual play show they can only find on YouTube, alright? Those episodes have, at most, a couple of hundred views each. Take the hint. Nobody's going back and watching your old show. Every time you promote it, it just feels like you're begging people to go back and watch it. It's just gross. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody's going back and watching your old actual play show. So stop referencing it like it's where all of your best ideas are. It's alienating your audience. So just knock it off. All right?
Understood. Loud and clear.
Good. See you soon.
I know how to beat Ottowick.